The Trudeau government has been accused of letting spending get out of control. Now, many would argue that's what led to the high inflation in our country and why so many Canadians are having a tough time after 8 years of Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister. As for health spending, it is apparently an entirely different story. Now, to chat about this in more detail is political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, our debt payments are actually outpacing health spending? How can that be?
Because of interest rates, because of bad bets that the federal government made on how to finance their debt, and the out of control spending we were doing during COVID. Remember, there was a lot of spending that was necessary during COVID, and then there was a lot of spending that wasn't. All of it driving up our deficits, our national debt, and that has to be financed along the way. Well, the Trudeau government didn't do a good job of managing it. Our debt costs have gone from 35 billion last year to 46 billion this year. It's about more than a 30% jump. And in this coming year, it's going to be about 11.5%. So we'll be spending $52.1 billion just servicing the interest on the debt next year. That's more than what we're scheduled to spend on transfers to the provinces and territories for healthcare. Only 49 billion from the federal government on healthcare, 52 billion on debt payments. To put it in another way, it's more than double what the federal government will spend on the military next year, and it's about nine and a half times what the federal government's spending on their much vaunted national $10 a day childcare program, which, by the way, is full of problems. They could fund that thing so that people were paying nothing if we didn't have these debt payments, but the debt payments are there and they're continuing to grow, and so is spending on all kinds of other things.
So what are some of the issues you're hearing regarding the National Child Care Plan?
Well, provinces are saying that it's created more demand than they have funding for at the moment. Ontario was the last province to sign, and I believe they were the only one that put in a review mechanism within it because they were worried that this would happen. I know in Alberta there's been talk of rolling shutdowns. There's been oversubscription in British Columbia, in Ontario, and other places. And so you've got this program that the Trudeau government says is one of their stellar achievements. They're only spending 5.6 billion on it this coming year from the federal government. Then there's the provincial money, municipal, etc. Only 5.6 billion. Compare that to 52 billion. 52 billion to pay off the interest, just the interest on stuff that we spent years ago. It's not a good way to run a government. This is why debts and deficits matter. This is why having a balanced budget matters. But that's not something the Trudeau government wants you to think about. They just want you to think you're getting free stuff. Well, that stuff costs money. And if you've got to spend all your money on servicing the debt, you can't have the nice things quite the way you want them.
Brian, the federal budget is set to be released on April the 16th. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland says a big focus on the budget will be about housing. Now, are you expecting another big spending budget here?
Absolutely. I mean, look, we've got the increased payments for the child care program we were just talking about. That increases every year. You've got the push for a dental program that's being rolled out. That, by the way, is really only costing a few hundred million at this point. Again, you want these nice things. It's easier to pay for them if you don't have that big debt. You've got the debt payments going up. You've got another 100 million for CBC. So, of course, there's going to be an awful lot of spending. In the Parliamentary Budget Officer's recent report on the debt, they said, if there's no additional spending, we can start seeing the debt payments go down over the coming years. There's going to be increased spending. So those debt payments aren't going down. Spending's going to continue to go up. When the Bank of Canada announced last week that they were not cutting interest rates, that they were holding firm at 5%, one of the reasons was they're not sure about government spending and where it's going. Well, why does that concern them? Because government spending, as you mentioned off the top, helps drive inflation. And instead of getting an interest rate cut and a bit of relief on your mortgage, on your line of credit, on the inflationary pressures we're all feeling, we could end up with increased inflationary pressures because of this government's budget. They simply can't get their act together on finances.
You know, many Canadians are still talking about the federal government's new pharmacare bill. Our premier here in Alberta, Daniel Smith, says we're not interested. Same with Quebec's Francois Legault. Doug Ford in Ontario says his province will not commit until they have more details, and BC already much has this in place. Brian, is this an actual pharmacare plan or more of maybe a political plan?
Well, if you read the bill, and I encourage people to do it because it's not very long, the reason is there's no detail in it, you quickly realize this is a political ploy. There is no there, even in the legislation. You know, Premier Ford here in Ontario was asked, well, what more details do you want? And I thought, haven't you read the bill? There's no details in the bill. So how would you sign on to it even if you were philosophically in tune with it? Look, Quebec already has a province-wide pharmacare plan. BC and Alberta, to varying degrees, do. Those two provinces, your province and next door, do very well at making sure that people either have insurance through their workplace or through government plans. Ontario, not as much, but they're saying to the federal government, help us out with rare disease drugs, help us out with these other plans, and instead, the federal government comes up with a plan they call Universal National Pharmacare. What does it cover? Birth control and diabetes medications. That's it. And you see in the way that Justin Trudeau was out last week, he had a news conference just a couple blocks from where I'm sitting at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, going on about the bravery of, fighting for birth control as if it was 1950 again, and how his government's, working to do this. This is all a ploy for votes from the NDP. They had to give the NDP something to keep them in the coalition, but they're going to campaign on this in the next election. Well, if you don't vote Liberal, Pierre Poilievre, I mean, he's going to take away your birth control. That's going to be part of the election ploy next time. This is all politics. It's all sizzle, no steak.
You know, when I heard that it only covered the diabetes drugs, which is very important, mind you, and contraceptives, my blood pressure went up. So I'm like, it doesn't even cover my blood pressure medication here, so that's no good. Now, Brian, the Trudeau government announced that they would resume funding for UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency in Gaza, even though there was evidence to suggest that some of the UNRWA members participated in the October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel. Brian, why aren't more Canadians outraged with UNRWA and that they're going to be receiving another, $25 million in taxpayer money next month? Also, will Justin Trudeau explain this decision to the families of the Canadian victims of that terrible attack?
I think an awful lot of Canadians are outraged, but they're not the Canadians that Trudeau is listening to. He's listening to his coalition partners in the NDP who are fully on Team Hamas. They're not even pretending anymore. They've got a motion that's coming up for a vote next week calling for a unilateral acknowledgement of a Palestinian state. So your response to Hamas launching a terror attack is to reward them with a state while they're still in charge? That's a foolish move. But Trudeau, again, trying to keep his coalition partners happy, trying to keep all the pressure groups that are, calling MPs' offices. And also, he just simply did the calculation that there are more Muslim votes than Jewish votes, and he believes that this is something that a large section of the Muslim community in Canada wants. You can give aid to Gaza, and if you see the images coming out of there, it's heart-wrenching. But you don't give the aid to UNRWA because it is so corrupted by Hamas that they are Hamas. In the views of many Israelis across the political spectrum, UNRWA is Hamas. There is no difference. I listened to the phone call intercepted by the Israeli Defense Forces of one elementary school teacher at an UNRWA school bragging that he had captured Sabeya. Sabeya is a term used by ISIS to describe the women they would take as sex slaves. And now Hamas is using that as well for some of their hostages. And this is an elementary school teacher. That's what we're rewarding here. And no, Justin Trudeau won't turn around and explain this. But remarkably, Melanie Joly is right now in Israel touring the sites of some of the massacres and the atrocities. She posted this morning a photo of the very first kibbutz that I visited when I was there a few weeks ago. It's unreal that you're giving funding to UNRWA one day, and a couple days later you're showing sympathy in the kibbutz. We could be working with the United States, which is going to build its own ways to deliver aid by sea. We could be working with European countries that still say, no, we can't back UNRWA. We could be doing all kinds of things. We're going the easy and political route because once again, Canada doesn't have a principled foreign affairs policy anymore. We have a foreign affairs policy driven by diaspora politics.
Last year, there was more outrage across the nation when it was revealed that Paul Bernardo was in a medium security prison, Brian. We've since learned that he's been joined by several other killers. Now, you say the number of people labeled as dangerous offenders in both medium and minimum security prisons is quite shocking. What did you discover?
Yeah, well, in addition to Paul Bernardo and Luca Magnotta being at the La Macasa prison in Quebec, Michael Rafferty, who was part of the brutal murder of 8-year-old Tori Stafford in 2009, is there. I've been told by multiple sources that Russell Williams, the high-flying Air Force officer, serial rapist and killer, is also there. But the overall issue of dangerous offenders, which some of these guys have been labeled dangerous offenders, you would think that those guys would be in maximum security prisons. They're not. Um, there was an order paper question put to the government for the fiscal year 2022-23. The government said there were 736 dangerous offenders, men and women, in Canadian prisons across the country. 57 of them were in minimum security prisons. 99 were in maximum security prisons. And the rest, I believe it's 580. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, and I'm not doing mental math right now. 580 were in medium security. If dangerous offenders aren't maximum security, who is? It's mind-boggling that this is the way things are going. But you know, just like the Trudeau Liberals said, least restrictive conditions for bail. They passed Bill C-83 that said least restrictive environment for prisoners. It's a philosophical mindset on the judicial system that is more concerned about the comfort and rights of prisoners than protecting society or looking after the rights of victims and their families.
A potential trade dispute with the United States could hurt Alberta ranchers. Now, Brian, what's the latest on labeling meat in the United States, and how could it directly impact our producers here?
Any of your viewers that are in the ranching game, anything associated with livestock, know about the seemingly never-ending battle of country of origin labeling, and this just seems like a redux of that. The United States is looking to allow or have new labeling that says product of the USA or made in the USA, but whether it's beef, pork, eggs, chicken, what have you, it has to be born in the USA, raised in the USA, slaughtered in the USA, and processed in the USA. Right now, rancher in Canada, and there's a very integrated ranching system, livestock system, meat production system in many parts. It's different depending on where you are in the continent, but there's a lot of symmetry in the industry back and forth. And right now, a rancher in Alberta, say, could rear the cattle, raise the cattle, but then ship it down to the States for finishing, slaughtering, and processing. Well, right now that can be called made in the USA. If everything has to happen in the USA, well, then all of a sudden that Canadian beef is useless to the producers in the United States. So they're not going to buy it. And much of our meat is done for export. So this is going to be a major thing, but this is all about Joe Biden, a more protectionist president even than Donald Trump or Barack Obama before him, and each president seems to get more protectionist these days. This is a play for votes by Biden. He wants to try and win back some of the votes. He's not going to get all of them, but he will get some votes with this in areas with large farming communities, and he needs all the help he can get as he heads towards November.
Speaking of politics, Brian, it appears as though the blue wave here in Canada continues to make its way across the country. It's funny. Blue in the States is Democratic, red is Republican, but here it's the opposite anyway. A massive rally for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre took place in Toronto recently. Interesting, since this isn't even an election year here in Canada.
Well, that was the shocking thing about it and why so many people took note. They had more than 3,000 people register, and somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people came out to the Toronto Congress Centre out in Etobicoke by the airport on a cold, blustery Sunday afternoon. Look, I know it's winter. I know it's Canada. How it's been pretty mild here in the GTA. Sunday was a bitter day. The temperature plummeted after a couple of mild days. Temperature plummets. The wind is brutal. You didn't want to be outside. He got about 3,000 people out to see him. to stand and holler and cheer for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives at a time, as you say, when there's no election. You and I have been around politics a long time. Getting that many people out during an election campaign can be difficult, even for a party that's in power and successful. And, you know, when you're in power and successful, that's the easiest time to get people to show up. When you're in opposition, it's harder. When there's no election, it's even harder. That's why it's remarkable. And between that and the Durham by-election, really showing that momentum is headed Poilievre's way.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today from Toronto.
Thank you, Hal.